Okay, next, let's cover the Russia and Central Asian realm. And really it's dominated by the big country of Russia. And there's also this area called Central Asia, which has this, what we call the Stan countries like Kazakhstan, and a handful of other countries in what's called Transcaucasia, near the Caucasus Mountains. Now, we'll come back and look at those more closely in a moment, but reminder, make sure you know your concepts, ideas, and terms from this chapter. Okay, now in the Europe chapter, we talked about the North European lowland. This is a kind of a wide plain that extends from the British Isles into Eastern Europe. And if we look at the Russia Central Asian realm, this is something called the Russian Plain. And really the Russian Plain is an extension of those Northern European lowlands. So those kind of keep going all the way to the Ural Mountains. And if you recall, the Ural Mountains are where we divide Europe from Asia. So you have essentially a European side of Russia and then another massive Asian side of Russia. Here's a figure from a different textbook showing the North European plain going kind of on into Russia, and we could also call it the Russian plain. This is from a different textbook, but just to kind of show you that physically Europe kind of keeps going on into Russia. There's no real physical division really until you hit the Ural Mountains. And then once you get beyond the Ural Mountains, then you get into what's called Siberia. And in Siberia, generally speaking, these have some different names, but generally this part beyond the Ural Mountains, you're getting into very forested, cold, and remote environments. So if we look at where people live, most of the people live over on the European side, and it gets very sparsely populated once you get into the interior of Russia, past that into that Siberian part. Maybe here's a better way of looking at it. You have this part of Russia, which is, we have the capital of Moscow, lots of roads, well connected to the rest of Europe, and then this is Siberia. You do have a railroad that goes into Siberia, but beyond that railroad, it can be very remote and very isolated, with very low population density. So here are the regions of the Russia Central Asian realm. We're not going to go into too much detail into the Far East and Southern frontier, but generally these are kind of part of this area we can call Siberia. Siberia is kind of the remote part of Asian part of Russia, and the Russian core is more of the European side of Russia in the west. And this is where most of the people live, most of the economic activity. This is really the core area of Russia. This is Central Asia. These are separate countries. They were once part of the Soviet Union. We'll talk about that. But they're now independent. And we call these the stans because they all end in stan, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And then we have this little area here called Transcaucasia, which has a handful of independent countries, including Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. We'll also come back and take a look at Eastern Europe, because if you see this kind of hatching mark here, what that means is that while these were part of the European chapter, that they could have gone either way. Part of Ukraine is more closely aligned with Russia. Part of Ukraine is more closely aligned with Western Europe. Belarus is a country that, while it sits in Europe, has close ties to Russia. And we even have an exclave of Russia which sits over here in Europe called Kaliningrad. So we'll talk about that eastern part of Europe as well. Now, just a little bit on population. In this part of the world, Russia is the dominant country. We talked about monocentric realms where there's one big dominant country. This is the best example because we're going to be mostly talking about Russia, and then we'll talk just a little bit about some of these other countries. Russia is the largest country in terms of its physical size in the world. It's nearly, it's massive. It's way bigger than the United States or China or Canada, which are the other big countries. However, the population is much smaller. That Russia only has maybe about 140 something million people. The US has over 300 million people. So maybe one way to kind of easy way to think about it, even if it's not exact, Russia is physically about twice the size of the United States, but with half the people in it. So double the size territorially, half the population. Now after Russia, the next largest country is Uzbekistan, but it's quite a difference between the population of Russia, over 100 million, and then only 30-something million in Uzbekistan. So Russia is clearly a dominant country, and so this is a good example of a monocentric geographic realm. Now just a little bit about a little bit of the economics. Now, while Russia is part of Europe physically and has some connections to it, now Russia is not the average person is not very wealthy in Russia. That Russia has a high amount of poverty, especially since the breakup of the Soviet Union. There is wealth in the country, but it's very concentrated in a few wealthy people, kind of what we call oligarchs in the country. So there's a big disparity between the rich and the poor. Now, where most of the wealth comes from is from oil. That Russia has about 10% of the world's oil reserves. And it's among the top oil producers in the world. Really the top three are Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia. Who's number one, number two kind of moves around depending on who's producing more. But Russia is one of the top three oil producers in the world. And much of the revenue of the country really depends on that oil. So where that can be a problem, we talked about this with Venezuela, that Venezuela where most of their economy was based on oil. Fluctuations in the price of oil can really kind of take their economy on a roller coaster ride. So while there is wealth, especially in the form of oil and gas, that wealth is not evenly distributed in the country. Now Russia is among the top natural gas producers, and natural gas production kind of goes hand in hand with oil production. So the United States and Russia are the two big gas producers. But one thing about Russia's relative location to Europe is that Russia supplies most of the natural gas to European countries. And this also allows Russia to exert influence. For example, when it was having conflicts with Ukraine one time, it used this gas as a kind of weaponized this by turning off the gas, changing the prices of the gas. So there is some concern in Europe about being too reliant upon Russia for their gas supplies. All right, and then we'll also come back and take a look at the regions, including Central Asia. We'll look at Transcaucasia, and then we'll come back again and talk about Eastern Europe.